Anna Nicole Smith looked like the kind of woman America was built to worship. Blonde hair, breathy voice, impossible beauty, small-town past, sudden fame. She was sold as fantasy, scandal, and desire, all at once. But the real reason her story still haunts people is not that she became famous. It is that everything she chased for safety, money, love, attention, status, motherhood, seemed to bring the next disaster closer, because this is not just the story of a bombshell who burned too brightly. It is the story of a woman who kept getting exactly what she thought would save her, only for each victory to open the door to something darker. A marriage that made her world famous also turned her into a national punchline. A legal fortune that looked like freedom became a war that consumed years of her life, and just when it seemed she might still have one last chance to rebuild, tragedy struck in a way so devastating it shattered whatever was left. So the real question is not how Anna Nicole Smith died. It is how a woman who had beauty, fame, money, and the attention of the entire world still ended up more vulnerable with every passing year. And by the time that answer becomes clear, her story no longer feels like tabloid gossip. It feels like one of the darkest cautionary tales Hollywood ever produced. To understand that collapse, you have to start before the headlines, before the old billionaire, before the old billionaire, before the Playboy shoots, before the lawsuits, before the television cameras found the most fragile version of her and froze it in the public mind. You have to go back to the girl she was before she became Anna Nicole Smith, because the tragedy did not begin when America started laughing at her. It began much earlier, in the kind of life that teaches a person to confuse rescue with love. She was born Vicki Lynn Hogan in Houston, Texas in 1967, and she did not grow up in anything close to the world she would later represent. There was no glamour around her, no polished route into elite life, no sense that she was headed toward celebrity. Her childhood was shaped by instability, limited money, and the kind of emotional uncertainty that leaves marks long after the facts themselves stop sounding dramatic. Her father was largely absent. Her mother worked. The life around her was ordinary in the hardest sense of the word, not calm, not secure, just ordinary enough that struggle became normal. That matters because people later treated Anna Nicole as if she came into the world scheming, as if she had been born understanding how to manipulate wealth, men, and attention. But that is not how these stories work. People who grow up with emotional and financial insecurity do not usually dream in abstract terms. They dream concretely. A house that feels safe, a man who stays, enough money that panic stops being part of daily life, a future that cannot be taken away overnight. Those are not glamorous ambitions. They are survival ambitions. And survival ambitions can make a person look reckless to people who have never had to build themselves out of desperation. As a teenager, Vicki did not move through life like someone carefully preparing for a polished career. She dropped out of high school. She worked low-paying jobs. She existed in the kind of narrow social world where it is very easy to become trapped in a future you never chose. The version of her life that the public would later consume, the pin-up fantasy, the red carpet scandal, the courtroom widow, was impossible to see from there. But one thing was already present: restlessness. She did not want a small life. She did not want to age quietly inside the limits of the place she came from. She wanted out, and that wanting would shape almost every major decision she made. She married young. That alone tells you a lot. Teen marriages often come from urgency rather than readiness. People reach for adulthood early because it looks like structure, escape, belonging. She married Billy Smith, a cook she met while working at Jim's Crispy Fried Chicken. They had a son, Daniel. For a brief moment, her story could still have turned into something quiet. She could have remained a Texas mother living a hard but anonymous life. No headlines, no tabloid mythology, no public collapse. But there was already something in her that refused that outcome. The marriage did not hold, and when it fell apart, it removed one of the last possible paths toward an ordinary life. That is where the tension really begins. Now she was young, poor, a mother, and still carrying the same hunger to escape. That combination is dangerous because it narrows your options while making the need for transformation feel urgent. She began working as a dancer. Later, many people would reduce that choice to morality or opportunism. But when you look at the actual structure of her life, it becomes easier to see what was happening. She had discovered that beauty was the only resource the world seemed willing to reward, quickly. And once a person learns that, especially someone already shaped by instability, it can become very hard to walk away from. Working in clubs also taught her something deeper than how to perform glamour. It taught her how projection works. Men did not simply look at her, they built fantasies around her. They saw innocence, desire, dependence, power, softness, status, and sexual availability all at the same time. That is an unstable kind of power because it is never fully yours. It belongs to the people imagining you. Still, for someone trying to rise out of poverty, it can look like the most direct route to safety. That was the trap inside Anna Nicole's rise. The very image that opened doors for her would later become the cage she could never escape. She began reshaping herself deliberately. Blonde hair, curves emphasized, Marilyn Monroe influence made obvious, the soft voice, the old Hollywood bombshell energy. None of this was accidental, it was reinvention. She understood that America did not just like beauty. It liked a very specific kind of beauty, a woman who felt both sexual and strangely vulnerable. A fantasy that invited desire, but also triggered the male urge to protect, possess, or laugh. That blend became her whole public language before she ever fully entered national fame. Then came the breakthrough, Playboy. For many women, Playboy offered exposure. For Anna Nicole, it offered identity. She was not presented as just another attractive model. She was framed as a throwback, a modern Marilyn, a woman who seemed to belong to an earlier fantasy of glamour. In 1992, she became Playmate of the Month. In 1993, she became Playmate of the Year. That kind of leap changes a life instantly. Suddenly, she was no longer Vicky Lynn Hogan from Texas trying to keep herself afloat. She was Anna Nicole Smith, a name built to sound unforgettable, glamorous, and slightly unreal. This is the point in the story where most audiences expect triumph. The girl escapes poverty. The beauty gets rewarded. The cameras find her. The culture validates what she always hoped was there. But in Anna Nicole's case, success created a different kind of danger. Fame did not erase her insecurity. It magnified it. It did not heal the need for rescue. It commercialized it. Now every unresolved thing inside her had to coexist with an image worth millions. Soon she was modeling for Guess, and this stage of her life matters because it represented the cleanest version of her celebrity. The photographs were striking. She was glamorous, curvy, radiant, and instantly recognizable. The campaigns helped cement her as more than a Playboy figure. She looked like a real pop culture icon in the making. But even here, the contradiction was already visible. The industry loved her image more than it loved her mind, voice, or complexity. She was being rewarded for becoming a fantasy, not for becoming stable. That distinction would shape everything that followed. The more visible she became, the more the public decided what kind of woman she was. That happens quickly with beautiful women in celebrity culture. They are assigned roles before they can define themselves. Anna Nicole was cast as the sexy blonde, the bombshell, the fantasy girl with the breathy voice and the small-town rough edges. And once that casting hardened, Every future action would be interpreted through it. If she spoke naively, she was dumb. If she spoke boldly, she was manipulative. If she dated a wealthy man, she was predatory. If she showed vulnerability, she was acting. The role was already larger than the person. Then came J. Howard Marshall. This is the chapter that made her famous in a different way, the chapter that transformed her from a rising model into a national obsession. Marshall was a Texas oil billionaire in his 80s. Anna Nicole was in her 20s. They met at a club in Houston. The age gap alone made the story explosive. The wealth gap made it irresistible. To the media, almost overnight, the public decided it knew everything. Gold digger, sugar, baby, old man's fantasy, cheap scandal. The relationship was judged so quickly and so harshly that almost no one paused to ask a more complicated question. What was each of them actually getting from this arrangement, and why did that arrangement provoke such intense cultural disgust? The obvious answer is money, but that answer is too shallow to explain why this relationship mattered so much to Anna Nicole. Marshall was not just rich. He represented the idea of permanent safety. He was old money, power, structure, legacy. For a woman raised in instability, that kind of man could feel like the human embodiment of protection. That does not make the relationship pure or selfless. It makes it psychologically legible. People often seek in romance what they missed in childhood. In Anna Nicole's case, what she seemed to miss most was permanence. They married in 1994. He was 89. She was 26. The photographs from the wedding did almost as much damage to her reputation as they did to her fame. She became instantly iconic and instantly ridiculed. The public response was brutal because it allowed people to flatten her into a cartoon. She was not seen as a woman navigating a complicated emotional and financial decision. She was seen as proof of greed, vulgarity, and bad taste. The culture found her useful at that moment because she made class resentment, sexual judgment, and moral superiority easy to perform. And then, just over a year later, Marshall died. This is where Anna Nicole's story stops being simple, scandal, and becomes something much darker. Because after his death, she expected security. Whether because of promises he made, expectations she built, or the emotional logic of the marriage itself, she believed she would receive a significant share of his estate. Instead, she entered a legal war that would consume years of her life and permanently distort her public identity. Marshall's son, E. Pierce Marshall, fought her claim. The battle quickly escalated into one of the most famous inheritance disputes in America. This was not just a courtroom fight. It became the central narrative attached to her name. Suddenly, Anna Nicole was not merely a model or celebrity. She was the widow, claiming a fortune. Every interview, every appearance, every joke about her led back to the same question. Was she a woman who had genuinely been promised security, or was she a manipulator trying to seize a dead man's money? That question poisoned her life because it forced her into a role she could never escape. Even when she tried to reintroduce herself as funny, glamorous, maternal, or sincere, the inheritance battle swallowed everything. It framed her as an opportunist first and a person second, and the longer the case dragged on, the more her life appeared to freeze around it. She could not simply move on. Too much of her identity, emotionally and publicly, was now tied to proving that the marriage had meant something real and that the security she thought she had won had not been an illusion. The legal war was long, expensive, and psychologically corrosive. Appeals, rulings, reversals, technical arguments, competing estates, procedural complexities. Most of the public did not follow the details. They only absorbed the broad outline. Anna Nicole still chasing the fortune. Anna Nicole still in court. Anna Nicole still attached to the old billionaire in death, as much as in life. But for her, the case was likely far more than tabloid content. It was a fight over meaning. If she lost, it would mean that the relationship the whole country mocked had not even delivered the one thing everyone assumed she wanted most. This is one of the cruelest dimensions of her story. The world mocked her for marrying wealth, then mocked her for not securing it cleanly. It treated her as mercenary, then laughed when the supposed transaction failed. There was no version of the story in which she was allowed dignity, and while this legal drama continued, another change was happening. Her image was shifting. At first, she had been sold as aspirational beauty, but slowly, almost invisibly at first, the public began to enjoy her less as a fantasy and more as a spectacle. This is the deadly turn in many celebrity stories. The audience stops admiring and starts feeding. Instead of asking whether the star will rise higher, it starts wondering how the star will unravel. Nicole entered that phase in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The glamour was still there in flashes, but something else had entered the frame. Emotional instability, weight fluctuations, rumors about medication, public appearances that felt unpredictable, interviews where she seemed unfocused, over-medicated, or deeply anxious beneath the surface. Rather than seeing a woman under pressure, much of the public saw comedy. That is essential to understand because Nicole was not just famous. She was becoming culturally disposable. People felt free to laugh at her confusion, her voice, her body, her timing, her relationships, her messiness. Once a culture decides someone is ridiculous, empathy becomes harder to access, and once empathy disappears, decline becomes entertainment. One of the reasons Nicole remains so tragic is that she was often transparent in ways that made her even easier to exploit. She did not always know how to hide damage. Some stars are protected by polish. She was not. The awkwardness, the neediness, the emotional disorder, the confused presentation of self, it all leaked through. That made her more human, but it also made her less safe in a media environment that rewarded collapse as long as it looked dramatic enough. And through all of this, one person remained central to her emotional world. Her son, Daniel. Daniel had been there before the fame, before the old billionaire, before the lawsuits turned her into a symbol. He was the living link to her original life. That matters more than people often realize. In a celebrity story built on reinvention, the people who knew you before the performance become emotionally invaluable. Daniel was not just her child. He was continuity. He was one of the few relationships in her life that did not begin as a transaction or public controversy. Whenever her image shifted, whenever the culture turned on her, whenever men, lawyers, photographers, and reporters filled her orbit, Daniel remained one of the only people who belonged to a more private version of her identity. That private anchor may be one reason she was able to endure as long as she did. By the early 2000s, however, endurance was becoming harder. The legal fight still lingered. Her career no longer had the same clean momentum as the Guess era. She was still famous, but the type of fame had changed. She was no longer simply being watched because she was beautiful. She was being watched because people sensed instability. That is a radically different position to occupy in public life. It invites different kinds of people into your orbit. Not just admirers or agents, but fixers, opportunists, enablers, and people who can benefit from confusion. This is where the story starts to feel dangerous. When a celebrity is emotionally unstable and physically vulnerable, the people closest to them matter more than ever. Who controls access? Who gives advice? Who provides medication? Who defines reality? Who says which threat is real and which ally can be trusted? In healthy circumstances, those roles are distributed carefully. In unhealthy circumstances, one or two individuals gain too much control. And Anna Nicole's life was beginning to look like the second kind. Then came the reality show. On paper, the Anna Nicole show looked like reinvention. Reality television was growing. Audiences were hungry for eccentric personalities. A series focused on her daily life, offered a way to turn notoriety into cash, and maybe even reshape public perception. But what it actually did was expose how unstable her private world had become. The show presented her as chaotic, childlike, heavily dependent on the odd ecosystem around her, playful one second and lethargic the next. Some viewers found it funny, others found it unsettling. In retrospect, it is hard to watch as pure entertainment. It often feels like footage of a person who is not fully in control being packaged as lovable disorder. Still, the show revealed something important. Anna Nicole was not cold. She was not a calculating machine. She could be warm, affectionate, funny, and disarmingly soft. But those qualities made the darker parts of her story even sadder. The more viewers saw that she was emotionally porous, the clearer it became that she was the kind of person who could be deeply damaged by the wrong environment. And the environment around her was not getting safer. Public humiliation continued. There were appearances where she seemed visibly unwell. Moments that should have sparked concern were replayed as jokes. One of the most notorious examples came at the 2004 American Music Awards when she appeared on stage and seemed disoriented. The clip spread everywhere. People mocked her speech, her pacing, her expression. The tone was cruelly familiar. Here was Anna Nicole again, the national punchline. But beneath the laughter was a more serious question. Why was a woman who looked so obviously impaired being treated as comedy rather than crisis? Because by then, the audience had been trained. Anna Nicole was no longer being read as someone in danger. She was being read as someone whose danger was part of her brand. That is what made her so vulnerable in the final years. Once a person becomes a spectacle, even obvious signs of decline fail to trigger urgency. People assume someone else is handling it. Or worse, they assume the person has chosen the chaos and therefore deserves it. Meanwhile, the legal battle over Marshall's estate kept dragging her backward. Even when rulings occasionally moved in her favor, the overall effect was exhaustion. The case was never just legal, it was existential. It kept her attached to the most mocked chapter of her life. It kept her fighting for a future she had imagined years earlier, and it kept reinforcing the public image that she was motivated entirely by greed, even though by this point what she may have needed most was not money itself, but closure, vindication, and proof that the sacrifice of her reputation had not all been for nothing. By this stage, Anna Nicole seemed to exist inside multiple collapsing identities at once. She was still the bombshell, but only in fragments. She was still the widow in court, but without resolution. She was still a television figure, but often in a way that felt humiliating rather than empowering. She was still a mother, but increasingly one living inside a chaotic adult world that did not seem built for protection. And through it all, her dependence on those around her appeared to deepen. That is where part one of her story really ends. Because the woman at this point is standing on the edge of the last chapter without fully seeing it. Yet, she had escaped poverty, but not insecurity. She had gained fame, but not respect. She had found powerful men, but not safety. She had built an image the entire country recognized, but that image had begun to consume the person underneath it. And just when it seemed there might still be time for a reset, a new beginning, a child, a softer future, the next phase of her life would bring the kind of blow that changes the emotional temperature of the whole story. Because what happened next was not just another scandal. It was the moment Anna Nicole Smith stopped looking like a woman in trouble and started looking like someone in free fall. The final chapter of Anna Nicole Smith's life begins with something that should have felt like hope. After years of ridicule, lawsuits, public humiliation, and visible instability, there was still one version of the story in which she could begin again. A new child, a new home base away from some of the noise, a chance to move from scandal into motherhood, from performance into something quieter and more private. Even for people who had watched her life become increasingly chaotic, there was still a lingering possibility that Anna Nicole might somehow pull herself out of the storm and build a softer future around the one role that seemed most emotionally real in her life, being a mother. That is what makes the next turn in the story so brutal. In September 2006, Anna Nicole gave birth to her daughter Dani in the Bahamas. On paper, this should have been one of the most redemptive moments of her life. The arrival of a child can sometimes reorganize a person. It can create urgency, focus, and a reason to protect what remains. For a woman like Anna Nicole, whose life had been built around the search for love, security, and emotional permanence, the birth of a daughter could have represented a final chance to attach herself to something pure and forward-looking. But almost immediately, that possibility was swallowed by confusion, spectacle, and conflict. Instead of peace, there was a fight over paternity. Howard K. Stern, the lawyer and constant companion who had become one of the dominant figures in Anna Nicole's life, publicly claimed he was the father. Larry Birkhead, a photographer who had been involved with Anna Nicole, insisted that he was the real father. Soon the birth of her daughter was no longer simply a personal event. It became another public war, another feeding frenzy, another chapter in which a highly vulnerable woman found one of the most intimate moments of her life turned into a national argument. The paternity battle mattered for more than legal reasons. It exposed the condition of Anna Nicole's world in her final year. A stable life does not look like this. A stable life does not turn a newborn into a disputed symbol within days of birth. A stable life does not require the public to guess which man is actually in control. And a stable life does not leave a mother this dependent on gatekeepers at the exact moment she should be protected from them. By now, Howard K. Stern had become impossible to separate from Anna Nicole's decline. He was not just her lawyer. He was her handler, advisor, emotional companion, spokesman, and gatekeeper. That concentration of influence is always dangerous around a fragile celebrity. It can look protective from the outside. It can even feel protective to the person at the center. But once one individual becomes the interpreter of reality for someone already exhausted, dependent, and emotionally unstable, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this person preserving her life or tightening control over it? In Anna Nicole's case, the answer never felt fully clear, which is part of what makes her final months so unsettling. Stern looked, depending on the observer, like a loyal defender who stayed when others laughed, or like a man whose life, relevance, and access all depended on remaining indispensable to a woman, no longer fully in command of herself. That ambiguity never disappeared. It only grew darker as the events around Anna Nicole accelerated. Then came the event that seems to divide her life into two distinct realities. Just days after Daniel was born, Anna Nicole's son Daniel traveled to the Bahamas to see his mother and newborn sister. Daniel was only 20 years old. He had been there long before the headlines, before the billionaire marriage, before the estate battles, before the world made his mother into a public symbol. He belonged to the original life, the version of Anna Nicole that existed before America turned her into content, and that made him emotionally irreplaceable. Then, in the hospital room, Daniel died. The timing of it is almost impossible to hear without feeling the full cruelty of the story. A mother welcomes a daughter into the world, and within days loses the son who had anchored her through every previous reinvention. There are tragedies that change a life. Then there are tragedies that seem to detonate whatever structure was left holding that life together. Daniel's death feels like the second kind. Toxicology results later showed that he had taken a combination of methadone and antidepressants, among other substances identified in his system. The exact pharmacological details became part of the reporting, but those details, while important, can distract from the larger emotional truth. For Nicole, Daniel's death was not just devastating. It appears to have been annihilating. He was not one relationship among many. He was the relationship that connected her to something older, more private, more innocent, more real than the world that had swallowed her. Once he was gone, a central stabilizing force in her life disappeared with him. This is the moment where the story stops feeling like celebrity scandal and starts feeling like emotional freefall. Witnesses and public footage from the period suggest that Nicole was shattered. Grief at that level does not arrive cleanly. It distorts time, judgment, memory, and physical survival. And for someone already under immense stress, already rumored to be dependent on prescription drugs, already psychologically fragile from years of scrutiny and conflict, the death of a child can destroy the last internal systems that made ordinary functioning possible. After Daniel's death, Nicole no longer seemed like a woman who might recover if given the right chance. She looked like someone barely staying upright from hour to hour. And yet, even then, the surrounding world did not become simpler or gentler. It became stranger. Not long after Daniel's death, Nicole and Howard K. Stern held a commitment ceremony in the Bahamas. It was not a legally binding marriage, but it was presented as a form of emotional union. To outsiders it looked bizarre, almost surreal in timing. To someone in Nicole's condition, it may have felt like an attempt to create structure in the middle of total psychological collapse. Grief often drives people towards symbolic certainty. When reality becomes unbearable, rituals can look like rescue. The problem is that ritual does not fix the underlying danger, and in Nicole's world, the danger was growing in every direction at once. The paternity fight continued. Legal uncertainty continued. Public fascination intensified, and beneath all of it sat a woman who had just experienced one of the worst losses imaginable while carrying the burden of fame, dependency, and unresolved personal chaos. At this point, another truth about her story becomes impossible to ignore. Nicole had spent years chasing safety through external things: men, money, fame, court victories, reinvention, beauty, public sympathy. But none of those things had created true stability. And now, when she needed stability more than ever, she seemed to have almost none. That is one of the deepest tragedies in her life. She kept moving toward what looked like salvation, only to discover that each version of salvation contained the next threat. The old inheritance battle still shadowed everything. Though there had been moments when the legal case seemed to favor her, it never delivered the clean final victory that might have eased the pressure on her life. Instead, it became a permanent atmosphere around her name. She was still attached to J. Howard Marshall in the public imagination, still the widow, still the claimant, still the blonde bombshell waiting for a dead man's money. The case had become more than litigation. It had become identity. No matter what else happened in her life, the culture kept dragging her back to the same cynical interpretation. That matters because public narratives can trap private people. If the world keeps telling you who you are, especially when you are vulnerable, it becomes harder to remember who you were before the role. Nicole was now carrying multiple identities that no longer fit together. She was the glamorous icon, the grieving mother, the unstable reality star, the tabloid widow, the legal combatant, the new mother of a disputed child, the dependent partner, the public joke. No one can live inside that many incompatible selves, without some part of the mind beginning to fracture under the strain. By late 2006 and early 2007, the visible signs of decline were becoming harder to deny. She looked exhausted. Her speech and movements often suggested heavy medication, extreme emotional overload, or both. The old Bombshell image still flickered in photographs and public appearances, but it felt increasingly disconnected from the reality of the woman carrying it. That split between image and condition had always existed in her life, but now it was extreme. The glamour remained marketable. The person beneath it looked close to collapse. This is why her death did not feel, in retrospect, like a shocking reversal. It felt like the final stage of a process many people had been watching without fully naming it. On February 8, 2007, Nicole Smith was found unresponsive in her room at the Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Hollywood, Florida. She was 39 years old. Emergency personnel were called. Efforts were made to revive her. They failed. A woman who had spent years as one of the most recognizable and mocked figures in American celebrity culture was dead before the age of 40. The immediate public reaction was revealing. There was sadness, certainly. There was shock. But there was also a grim tone of inevitability. That tone is one of the most disturbing aspects of her story, because it suggests that many people had unconsciously been waiting for this ending. Once a culture spends long enough turning visible suffering into entertainment, death can begin to feel like the conclusion of a narrative arc rather than the destruction of a human life. Nicole had been transformed so thoroughly into spectacle that even her death risked being read as one more episode. The investigation that followed revealed the cause as an accidental overdose involving prescription drugs, with chloral hydrate playing a major role along with other medications in her system. That distinction is important. Nicole did not die from the simplest tabloid version of self-destruction. She died in the grey modern zone of prescription medication overlap, the kind of death that often emerges when emotional fragility, chronic medical management, poor supervision, and dependency become indistinguishable from ordinary daily survival. That is one reason her story feels both personal and symbolic. She was a singular celebrity, but her manner of decline reflected something much broader in American life. The culture that mocked her for seeming drugged or unstable was also entering an era shaped by prescription dependency, doctor shopping, overlapping medications, and the quiet normalization of chemically assisted coping. Nicole's tragedy was highly visible, but it was not as unusual as people preferred to believe. It simply wore blonde hair and designer glamour, which made it easier to both fetishize and dismiss. After her death, the chaos did not end. It intensified. There were disputes over her burial, disputes over her estate, disputes over control of Danilin. Even in death, Nicole was not permitted stillness. Her body became the center of conflict. Her daughter became the center of conflict. The very things she had spent much of her life chasing, family, permanence, security, meaning, remained unresolved around her even after she was gone. That continuation of disorder is important because it shows how little of her life had ever truly been stabilized by fame or fortune. The structure around her was so weak that it kept splintering after the person herself had died. Eventually, DNA testing confirmed that Larry Burkhead was Danny Lynn's biological father. That revelation ended one part of the public circus, but not before exposing just how unstable Nicole's final circumstances had become. For a newborn child to enter the world, amid that much confusion, tells you almost everything about the state of the adult environment around her. Burkhead gained custody, and in hindsight, that outcome feels like one of the few points where a line was finally drawn around the child at the center of the storm. But even that did not bring true closure. Because the deeper questions around Anna Nicole's death remained. Investigators and prosecutors examined the behavior of some of the doctors and professionals around her. Questions were raised about prescriptions, medical ethics, and the role played by those who had access to her. There were charges, scrutiny, legal maneuvers, and years of argument over who had done what. Not every case ended in conviction. Not every allegation held the same weight, but the broader picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Anna Nicole had not simply wandered into death unaided. She had lived inside an environment where a highly vulnerable person had access to too many powerful medications with too little meaningful protection. And that takes us to one of the hardest truths in her story. Celebrity collapse almost never belongs to one person alone. It requires supporting architecture. It requires people who sign prescriptions too loosely, companions who refuse to set limits, handlers who benefit from confusion, professionals who normalize visible dysfunction, and a media system willing to monetize deterioration in real time. Anna Nicole was not just making bad choices in a vacuum. She was moving through a network that often seemed better at sustaining her spectacle than safeguarding her life. That does not erase her agency. She was an adult. She made choices. She pursued wealth, reinvention, attention, and escape in ways that sometimes exposed her to greater danger. But mature understanding of tragedy is not about choosing between agency and exploitation. It is about seeing how both can coexist. Anna Nicole could be ambitious and manipulated. She could be strategic and emotionally lost. She could be complicit in her image and trapped by it. That is what makes her story so resistant to simple morality. The easiest version of her life is that she was reckless and doomed. The harder, more honest version is that she was wounded, driven, repeatedly used, and left to disintegrate in front of an audience that had long since stopped seeing her clearly. The Marilyn Monroe comparison followed her in life and grew even stronger in death. On the surface, the parallels are obvious. Blonde bombshell image, breathy sensuality, public desire mixed with ridicule, chemical vulnerability, early death. But the comparison can also flatten what was specific about Anna Nicole. She was not merely repeating Marilyn's script. She was living out a late 20th century, early internet-era version of the same national hunger. America loves women. It can first idealize, then sexualize, then infantilize, then destroy. Anna Nicole fit that machinery perfectly, which is why it consumed her so effectively. And yet, reducing her to an archetype also does her an injustice. She was not only symbol. She was a real woman from Texas who wanted out of poverty, wanted emotional safety, wanted admiration, wanted permanence, wanted family, wanted to believe that beauty could carry her toward a life secure enough to stop fearing collapse. Those desires were not absurd. They were human. What was tragic is that the routes available to her kept turning those desires into vulnerabilities. If you look back over the whole story, a pattern becomes unmistakable. When she needed security, she reached for marriage and money. That led to ridicule and endless litigation. When she needed validation, she embraced the bombshell image. That led to objectification and public simplification. When she needed career revival, she embraced reality television. That turned instability into mass entertainment. When she needed emotional grounding, she leaned on a shrinking circle of powerful figures around her. That increased her dependency. When she needed hope, she had a daughter, and almost immediately that moment was invaded by dispute, grief, and confusion. Then she lost Daniel, the person who may have mattered most to her emotionally, and after that, whatever chance remained for recovery seems to have collapsed. That is why the tragic story of Anna Nicole Smith is not simply that she died young. It is that she spent her whole adult life trying to outrun insecurity and somehow kept arriving at new versions of it. Every apparent breakthrough contained the next disaster inside it. Fame made her visible but not safe. Wealth came near her but never settled around her securely. Love offered comfort but rarely stability. Public attention made her unforgettable but stripped away privacy and dignity. By the end, even motherhood, the role that seemed most genuinely anchored in her heart, became entangled with unimaginable loss. And then there is Daniel again, because any final understanding of Anna Nicole returns to him. Before he died, her life still had some emotional continuity. However damaged things were, she still had someone who belonged to the pre-fame world, someone who linked her to a version of herself not built by magazine covers or court filings. After his death, that bridge seems to have vanished. A woman can survive humiliation, addiction, lawsuits, and public contempt longer than people think. The death of a child is different. It can split life into before and after so violently that the self that existed before never fully returns. In Anna Nicole's case, that appears to be exactly what happened. So what was the real tragedy of America's most famous blonde bombshell? It was not just that she was beautiful and doomed. That is too shallow. It was that she was easy for people to misunderstand, because they kept reading the performance and missing the hunger underneath it. Hunger for safety, hunger for love that lasted, hunger for a structure no one could take away, hunger to stop feeling disposable. She used beauty as currency because beauty was one of the few assets the world rewarded quickly. She used fame as leverage because fame seemed stronger than poverty. She attached herself to powerful men because power looked like protection. She fought in court because losing meant admitting the bargain had failed. And somewhere along the way, the strategies that were supposed to save her became the architecture of her destruction. What remains now is not just the spectacle. It is the warning. Anna Nicole Smith's life shows what happens when a culture mistakes visible pain for entertainment, when the people around a vulnerable person gain more from her instability than from her recovery. And when a woman becomes so trapped inside the fantasy projected onto her that even her real suffering gets filtered through performance. She was glamorous enough to obsess over, flawed enough to mock, damaged enough to feed an audience, and famous enough that all of it could happen under bright lights. She wanted to become impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more.